Wicked billionaire husband pushed wife down from a
Please,
helicopter
don't
because
do
she
this.
queefed on his
I'm begging
cock,
you.
but she survived and did this. What happens when a billionaire's cruelty pushes his innocent wife to the brink of death? He returns stronger, determined for justice. You won't believe how it ends. Justice, strength, and unexpected twists await. Subscribe now and stay tuned for more gripping stories like this. Sarah Martinez never imagined her life would end with a helicopter door slamming shut behind her. But that's exactly what happened when her billionaire husband discovered her most embarrassing moment at 30,000 feet. What she did next will leave you speechless. Survival and the most shocking revenge you've ever heard. To reclaim everything that was stolen from her. Make sure you stay until the end because the twist will blow your mind. Sarah had always been ordinary. Growing up in a small town in Ohio, she worked double shifts at the local diner just to pay rent on her cramped studio apartment. Her dreams were simple: find someone who loved her, maybe start a family, live quietly without the constant worry about money. She never expected to catch the attention of someone like Richard Blackwood. Richard wasn't just wealthy. He was disgustingly rich, the kind of rich that bought politicians and owned entire city blocks. When he walked into Sarah's diner that rainy Tuesday morning, everything changed. He was tall, impeccably dressed, with the kind of confidence that comes from never hearing the word no. His eyes locked onto Sarah immediately. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice smooth as expensive whiskey. "Sarah," she replied, her hands trembling slightly as she poured his coffee. "Sarah," he repeated, like he was tasting the word. Beautiful name for a beautiful woman. From that moment, Richard became obsessed with Sarah. He'd show up at the diner every day, leaving $100 tips for $20 meals. He'd send flowers to her apartment, expensive gifts that made her neighbors whisper. Sarah had never experienced anything like it. For the first time in her life, she felt special, chosen, like she mattered to someone important. When Richard proposed after just 3 months of dating, Sarah's head was spinning. The ring alone cost more than she'd made in her entire life. Everyone told her she was living a fairy tale, that she'd hit the lottery. Sarah wanted to believe it too. The wedding was everything Sarah had dreamed of and more. Designer dress, 5-star venue, guests who belonged in magazines. Richard spared no expense, and Sarah felt like a princess walking down that aisle. She thought she'd found her happily ever after, but fairy tales don't exist in the real world. The first cracks started showing during their honeymoon. Richard's charm began to feel calculated, his compliments backhanded. When Sarah gained a few pounds from all the fancy dinners, Richard's comments turned cruel. "You're letting yourself go already?" he'd sneer. "I didn't marry a slob." Sarah tried to laugh it off, but the words cut deep. She started watching everything she ate, spending hours at the gym, desperately trying to maintain the image Richard expected. Nothing was ever good enough. Things got worse when Sarah got pregnant. She was thrilled, thinking a baby would bring them closer together. Richard saw it differently. "Great, now you'll be even more disgusting," he said when she told him the news. "Try not to balloon up like a whale." Throughout her pregnancy, Richard's cruelty intensified. He'd bring other women to business dinners, flaunting his affairs in front of Sarah. He'd criticize her appearance constantly, calling her names that made her cry herself to sleep. Sarah felt trapped, isolated, with nowhere to turn. When their daughter Emma was born, Sarah hoped Richard would soften. Instead, he seemed to resent both of them. He'd disappear for days, coming home smelling like expensive perfume and lies. Sarah poured all her love into Emma, trying to shield her from Richard's coldness. "You're pathetic," Richard would tell Sarah. "No wonder I can't stand being around you." The final straw came on what was supposed to be their second wedding anniversary. Richard announced they were taking a romantic helicopter trip to his private island. Sarah was desperate to believe he still cared, that maybe they could fix their broken marriage. As they flew over the Pacific Ocean, Sarah felt a familiar rumble in her stomach. She'd been nervous about the trip, and her anxiety always affected her digestion. She tried to hold it in, but the pressure in the helicopter cabin made it impossible. The sound was small, barely audible over the helicopter's rotor blades, but Richard heard it. His face twisted with disgust and rage. "Did you just fart?" he screamed, his voice filled with venom. "You disgusting piece of trash!" "Richard, I'm sorry. I couldn't help it," Sarah pleaded, mortified. You've embarrassed me for the last time, Richard snarled. I'm done with you. Before Sarah could react, Richard lunged forward and grabbed her. The helicopter door slid open, and Sarah found herself staring down at the churning ocean below. Richard, please, think about Emma. She needs her mother. She'll be better off without you, Richard replied coldly. We both will. With that, he shoved Sarah out of the helicopter. The fall felt like it lasted forever. Sarah's scream was lost in the wind as she plummeted toward the water. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs, and she sank deep beneath the waves. For a moment, she thought this was it, that Richard had finally won. But something inside Sarah refused to give up. Maybe it was the thought of Emma growing up without her mother, or maybe it was pure spite. But Sarah fought her way to the surface. She gasped for air, treading water as the helicopter disappeared into the distance. Sarah swam for what felt like hours, her evening dress weighing her down, her lungs burning. Just when she thought she couldn't go any further, she spotted land, a small island, uninhabited but real. She dragged herself onto the rocky shore and collapsed, coughing up seawater. She was alive, but barely. The island was remote, with no signs of civilization. Sarah had to learn to survive on her own, eating whatever she could find, drinking rainwater, sleeping in caves. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The soft, pampered woman who had fallen from that helicopter was gone, replaced by someone harder, stronger, more determined. Sarah wasn't just surviving anymore. She was planning every day on that island. She thought about Richard, about Emma, about the life that had been stolen from her. She wouldn't just return from the dead. She'd return with a vengeance. After 6 months on the island, Sarah was rescued by a passing fishing boat, but she didn't go home immediately. Instead, she spent the next 2 years carefully planning her comeback. She used the survival skills she'd learned to become a wilderness guide, building a reputation and a network of contacts. She saved every penny, invested wisely, and slowly built her own fortune. More importantly, she gathered evidence. Richard thought she was dead, so he'd gotten sloppy. Sarah discovered his money laundering operations, his connections to organized crime, his history of violence against women. She compiled everything, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When Sarah finally returned to civilization, she was unrecognizable. Gone was the timid woman who'd been pushed around and humiliated. In her place stood someone confident, powerful, and absolutely ruthless. She'd learned that in this world, you either eat or get eaten, and she was done being dinner. Sarah's first move was to secure custody of Emma. Richard had told everyone that Sarah had died in a tragic accident, but Sarah had proof of what really happened. The custody battle was vicious, but Sarah had something Richard didn't expect: the truth. "Mommy," Emma whispered, when she saw Sarah for the first time in 3 years. "Daddy said you were dead." "I'm here now, baby," Sarah said, holding her daughter tight, "and I'm never leaving you again." Richard's world started crumbling fast. Sarah released the evidence of his crimes to the FBI, the IRS, and every major news outlet. His business empire collapsed overnight. His assets were frozen, his associates arrested, his reputation destroyed. But Sarah wasn't finished. She'd learned patience on that island, and she wanted Richard to suffer the way she had suffered. She systematically destroyed everything he cared about, using his own tactics against him. She bought his debts, foreclosed on his properties, turned his friends against him. The final confrontation came at Richard's bankruptcy hearing. He was a broken man, his expensive suits replaced by a cheap off-the-rack outfit, his arrogance replaced by desperation. "You destroyed me," he whispered when he saw Sarah in the courtroom. "No," Sarah replied calmly. "You destroyed yourself. I just made sure everyone knew about it." Richard was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. Sarah got everything: the house, the businesses, the offshore accounts. More importantly, she got Emma back, and she got her life back. Standing in the mansion that had once been her prison, Sarah looked out at the ocean where she'd almost died. She'd survived the impossible, transformed from victim to victor. Richard had tried to throw her away like garbage, but she'd returned as his judge, jury, and executioner. The scared little girl from Ohio was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who'd learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the only way to get justice is to take it yourself. Sarah Martinez had queefed on her husband's ego, and he'd tried to kill her for it. But she'd risen from the depths of the ocean like a vengeful goddess, and now Richard Blackwood was the one drowning in the consequences of his cruelty. Now, the twisted mind of Richard Blackwood believed he had erased Sarah Martinez from existence, but what he didn't know was that the ocean had other plans. As Sarah's body disappeared beneath the waves, Richard returned to his mansion, immediately crafting his lies. He told everyone that Sarah had suffered a tragic accident during their romantic getaway. The grieving widower act came naturally to him, complete with crocodile tears and staged memorial services. But while Richard played the victim, Sarah was fighting for her life on that remote island. The first weeks were pure hell. Her body was broken, her spirit shattered, but her love for Emma kept her breathing. She learned to make fire from nothing, to find fresh water in the most unlikely places, to turn poisonous plants into medicine. The island became her university, teaching her lessons no classroom ever could. What Richard didn't anticipate was Sarah's incredible transformation. Month by month, she grew stronger, smarter, more determined. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was thriving. The same hands that once trembled at his voice now built shelter from storms. The same mind that once believed his lies now calculated every move of her eventual return. During those long nights under foreign stars, Sarah made a discovery that would change everything. Hidden in the rocks near her shelter, she found something that made her blood run cold. Richard's helicopter had crashed here before, not with her, but with someone else, another woman, another wife. Sarah realized with horror that she wasn't his first victim. Among the wreckage, she found documents, photographs, evidence of Richard's true nature, bank statements showing money laundering operations, photos of him with dangerous criminals, records of other women who had mysteriously disappeared. Sarah understood then that her attempted murder wasn't a crime of passion, it was part of a pattern. Richard Blackwood was a serial killer who used marriage as his hunting ground. This revelation transformed Sarah's mission from personal survival to something much bigger. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every woman Richard had destroyed and every woman he planned to destroy next. She carefully preserved every piece of evidence, protecting it like precious treasure. The island's isolation, which had initially seemed like a curse, became her greatest advantage. She had time to heal, time to plan, time to become someone Richard would never recognize. The broken housewife he had thrown from that helicopter was gone forever. In her place stood a warrior, forged by betrayal and tempered by justice. Sarah's rescue came through her own ingenuity. She had learned to signal passing ships using mirrors and smoke signals. When a cargo vessel finally spotted her distress signals, she was ready. But instead of immediately revealing her identity, she chose to remain dead to the world a little longer. She needed time to prepare for the war that was coming. Working with the ship's captain, who was moved by her story, Sarah arranged for discreet transport back to civilization. She didn't go home. She went to the shadows. Using the evidence she had gathered, she began building a network of allies, private investigators, journalists, law enforcement officers who had been trying to build cases against Richard for years. The irony was perfect. While Richard believed he was untouchable, Sarah was systematically dismantling his empire from the inside. She used her presumed death as the ultimate cover, allowing her to investigate without his knowledge. She discovered offshore accounts, shell companies, and a web of corruption that reached into the highest levels of society. But Sarah's masterstroke wasn't just gathering evidence, it was understanding Richard's psychology. She knew his arrogance was his weakness. He believed he was too smart to be caught, too powerful to be challenged. Sarah planned to use that arrogance against him, to make him destroy himself through his own hubris. The most painful part of her investigation was learning about Emma. Richard had told their daughter that Mommy had abandoned them, that she never loved her enough to stay. Emma, now older and filled with resentment, had been poisoned against her mother's memory. Sarah watched from the shadows as her daughter grew up believing lies, and it nearly broke her heart all over again. But Sarah's love for Emma gave her strength to continue. She knew that exposing Richard's crimes would also expose his lies about her disappearance. Emma would learn the truth about her mother's love, about the sacrifice Sarah had made trying to return to her. As Sarah's network grew stronger, she began to understand the full scope of Richard's criminal empire. He wasn't just a killer, he was a kingpin who used his legitimate businesses to launder money for international crime syndicates. His victims weren't just his wives, they were anyone who threatened his operations. The evidence Sarah gathered painted a picture of a man who had built his fortune on blood and terror. She found records of bribery, extortion, and murder going back decades. Richard Blackwood wasn't just a bad husband, he was one of the most dangerous criminals in the country. But gathering evidence was only half the battle. Sarah needed to find a way to bring Richard down without putting Emma in danger. She knew that cornering a predator like Richard could make him desperate enough to hurt their daughter. Every move had to be calculated. Every strategy had to protect the innocent. Sarah's transformation was complete when she looked in the mirror and saw not a victim, but a force of nature. The woman staring back had survived the impossible and emerged stronger than ever. She had learned to trust her instincts, to fight for what she believed in, to never again allow someone else to define her worth. The island had taught her that survival wasn't just about staying alive, it was about refusing to let evil win. Sarah Martinez had died in that helicopter, but the woman who emerged from the ocean was something Richard Blackwood had never encountered before. She was his reckoning, his judgment, his ultimate downfall. As Sarah prepared for her return to the world, she made a solemn promise to every woman Richard had destroyed. Their deaths would not be in vain. Their stories would be told. Their killer would finally face justice. The hunt was about to begin, and this time, Richard Blackwood was the prey. Now that Sarah had the evidence and resources she needed, the real war was about to begin. But what she discovered next would make her question everything she thought she knew about Richard's cruelty. The truth was far more twisted than even she had imagined. Sarah had spent 3 years building her case methodically, gathering evidence like a hunter setting traps. Every financial record, every witness statement, every piece of documentation that could expose Richard's crimes had been carefully cataloged and preserved. She had allies now, powerful people who believed in her cause and were willing to help bring down the monster who had destroyed so many lives. But as she prepared to launch her final assault on Richard's empire, something unexpected happened that would change everything. It started with a phone call from Detective Martinez, the lead investigator on her case. His voice was tense, urgent in a way that made Sarah's stomach clench with familiar fear. "Sarah, we need to meet. There's something you need to know about Richard. Something that changes everything we thought we understood about his crimes." She agreed to meet him at a small cafe downtown, away from prying eyes and listening ears. When Detective Martinez arrived, his face was pale, his hands shaking slightly, as he placed a thick manila folder on the table between them. "What I'm about to show you," he said quietly, "it's going to be hard to process. We've been investigating Richard for months now, following the evidence you provided, and we uncovered something that goes deeper than we ever imagined." Sarah's heart pounded as she opened the folder. Inside were photographs, documents, and what appeared to be psychological evaluations dating back decades. The first document made her blood run cold. It was a psychiatric report from when Richard was 12 years old, detailing horrific abuse he had suffered at the hands of his own father. The report described a pattern of violence so severe that it had left permanent psychological scars on the young boy who would grow up to become the monster she knew. But that was just the beginning. As Sarah read further, she discovered that Richard's father had been part of an underground network of wealthy men who engaged in unspeakable acts of violence against women and children. The network had operated for generations, passing down their twisted traditions from father to son like a cursed inheritance. Richard hadn't just stumbled into his life of crime and cruelty. He had been systematically groomed and trained for it from childhood. Detective Martinez watched her face as she processed the information. "There's more," he said softly. "We found evidence that Richard tried to escape this life when he was younger. He attempted suicide twice in his early 20s, and there are medical records showing he sought therapy to try to break free from the patterns his father had instilled in him. But every time he tried to get help, someone from the network would pull him back in." Sarah felt sick as she read about Richard's failed attempts to become a better person. There were letters he had written to therapists, desperate pleas for help in breaking free from the violent urges that had been beaten into him as a child. There were records of him donating anonymously to women's shelters, as if trying to atone for sins he hadn't yet committed. For a brief moment, Sarah felt something she never thought she would feel for Richard: pity. But then she remembered Emma, her daughter who had been taken from her. She remembered the other women whose lives Richard had destroyed, the families he had torn apart. Whatever trauma he had suffered as a child, whatever attempts he had made to change, none of that excused the choices he had made as an adult. He had become the very monster his father had trained him to be, and he had to face the consequences of that transformation. Detective Martinez continued explaining what they had discovered. The network is still active, Sarah. Richard isn't just a lone predator. He's part of something much bigger, something that has tentacles reaching into the highest levels of government, business, and society. Taking him down is just the first step. We need to expose the entire operation. Sarah felt the weight of this revelation settling on her shoulders. She had thought her fight was against one man, one monster who had destroyed her life. Now she realized she was up against something far more sinister and powerful. The network had resources, connections, and decades of experience in covering up their crimes. They wouldn't go down without a fight, and they would use every weapon at their disposal to protect themselves. But Sarah wasn't the same broken woman who had been pushed from that helicopter years ago. She was stronger now, smarter, more determined than ever. If Richard was part of a larger conspiracy, then she would expose them all. She would bring justice not just for herself and Emma, but for every victim who had suffered at the hands of these monsters. Over the following weeks, Sarah worked closely with Detective Martinez and a team of federal investigators to map out the network's operations. They discovered that the organization called themselves the Brotherhood, and they had been operating for over a century. They had members in every major city, every level of government, every industry where power and wealth concentrated. They protected each other, covered up each other's crimes, and recruited new members from among the children of the elite. The more Sarah learned about the Brotherhood, the more she understood Richard's psychology. He wasn't just a cruel husband who had snapped in a moment of rage. He was a carefully programmed weapon, designed from childhood to inflict maximum damage on those around him. His marriage to her hadn't been a coincidence. The Brotherhood had identified her as a potential victim, someone whose disappearance wouldn't be thoroughly investigated, whose family lacked the resources to fight back. But they had made a crucial mistake. They had underestimated Sarah's strength, her determination, her ability to survive and fight back. Now their entire operation was in jeopardy because of one woman who had refused to stay dead. Sarah knew that exposing the Brotherhood would be dangerous. These weren't ordinary criminals who could be taken down with standard police work. These were powerful, connected individuals who had spent generations perfecting their methods of avoiding consequences. They had judges in their pockets, politicians on their payroll, and law enforcement officials who looked the other way in exchange for money and protection. But Sarah had advantages they didn't expect. She had the element of surprise, the moral authority of a victim seeking justice, and most importantly, she had the truth on her side. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and she had allies who were willing to risk everything to help her expose these monsters. The plan they developed was complex and dangerous. They would coordinate simultaneous raids on Brotherhood properties across multiple states, arrest key members before they could destroy evidence or flee the country, and release all the evidence to the media at once to prevent any cover-up attempts. It would be the largest organized crime takedown in American history. Sarah's role would be crucial. As the star witness, the survivor who could testify to the Brotherhood's methods and Richard's crimes, she would be the face of the prosecution's case, but she would also be the primary target for retaliation. The Brotherhood would do everything in their power to silence her before she could testify. Detective Martinez arranged for Sarah to be placed in protective custody, but she refused. She had spent too many years hiding, too many years living in fear. She wouldn't spend her final battle cowering in a safe house while other people fought for justice on her behalf. She would face the Brotherhood head-on, just as she had faced Richard in that boardroom. The night before the raids were scheduled to begin, Sarah stood in her hotel room overlooking the city where her nightmare had begun. Tomorrow, she would either triumph completely or die trying. But either way, she would face her fate with dignity, strength, and the knowledge that she had fought for what was right. She thought about Emma, about the life they could have together once this was all over. She thought about the island where she had learned to be strong, about Anna and the villagers who had shown her what true kindness looked like. She thought about all the women who had suffered at the hands of the Brotherhood, all the children who had been groomed to become monsters, all the families that had been destroyed by these predators. Tomorrow, their reign of terror would end. Tomorrow, justice would finally be served, and Sarah Martinez, the woman who had survived the impossible, would be the one to deliver it. The war was about to begin, and Sarah was ready. Sarah's transformation was nothing short of extraordinary. As she lay on that hospital bed, her body broken but her spirit unshattered, she made a decision that would change everything. The old Sarah, the one who had once been meek and compliant, was gone forever. What emerged from those months of recovery was something Victor Reed had never anticipated. A woman forged by fire, tempered by betrayal, and sharpened by an unquenchable thirst for justice. The first phase of her plan was deceptively simple. Sarah needed to understand her enemy completely. Every business deal, every connection, every dirty secret that Victor had accumulated over the years. She started small, using her recovery time to quietly gather intelligence. Hospital staff, delivery workers, even the janitors became her unwitting sources of information. People talked around someone they perceived as helpless, and Sarah was an expert listener now. What she discovered made her blood run cold. Victor's cruelty wasn't random or impulsive. It was calculated, systematic, and part of something much larger than she had ever imagined. The Brotherhood wasn't just a network of wealthy men protecting each other's interests. It was a generational system of abuse, control, and elimination. Women who became inconvenient didn't just disappear. They were systematically destroyed, their reputations ruined, their children taken, their very existence erased from the world. Sarah learned about Margaret Whitmore, a senator's wife who had threatened to expose her husband's corruption. She had supposedly died in a skiing accident, but the truth was far more sinister. There was Jennifer Blackthorne, a tech entrepreneur who had discovered her partner's embezzlement. She had allegedly committed suicide, but the evidence suggested otherwise. The list went on and on, a horrifying catalog of women who had been silenced because they knew too much or fought back too hard. But Sarah also discovered something else, something that would become the foundation of her revenge. Every single one of these operations had been meticulously documented. The Brotherhood kept records of everything, partly for blackmail purposes and partly out of sheer arrogance. They believed themselves untouchable, so they documented their crimes like trophies. Victor, in particular, had kept detailed files on every woman he had helped destroy. Photos, recordings, financial records, even personal diaries that had been stolen from victims. The irony was delicious. Their own arrogance would become their downfall. Sarah's second phase began when she was finally discharged from the hospital. She had convinced everyone, including the doctors, that she was suffering from severe amnesia. She remembered nothing about the helicopter incident, nothing about her marriage to Richard, nothing about Emma. As far as the world knew, Sarah Martinez was a blank slate, a victim of a terrible accident who needed to rebuild her life from scratch. This gave her the perfect cover. She moved to a small apartment across town, took a job at a local diner, and began living the life of an ordinary woman with a tragic past. But beneath this facade, she was anything but ordinary. Every spare moment was spent learning, preparing, and planning. She studied business, law, technology, and most importantly, she studied people, how they thought, how they made decisions, how they could be manipulated. She also began building her network, not the kind of network that Richard had, built on power and fear, but something far more valuable. She connected with other survivors, women who had escaped abusive relationships, investigators who had seen too much corruption, journalists who had been silenced by powerful interests. These people understood injustice intimately, and they were hungry for the chance to fight back. The breakthrough came almost 2 years after her supposed death. Sarah had been working as a waitress at an upscale restaurant when she overheard a conversation between two of Richard's business associates. They were discussing a new venture, something about expanding their operations into human trafficking. The casual way they discussed destroying lives, the matter-of-fact tone they used when talking about eliminating witnesses, made Sarah's blood freeze. That night, she made a decision that would accelerate her timeline. She couldn't wait any longer. Too many women were suffering while she prepared her perfect revenge. It was time to strike back. Sarah's first target wasn't Richard himself. That would come later. Instead, she focused on David Chen, one of the Brotherhood's key financial coordinators. Chen was responsible for laundering money from their various illegal operations, and he had been present during several of the planning sessions for other women's disappearances. He was also arrogant, careless, and had a weakness for young women who reminded him of his own daughter. Sarah spent weeks studying Chen's habits, his routines, his psychological profile. She learned that he frequented a particular coffee shop every Tuesday morning, always ordering the same drink, always sitting in the same corner booth. She discovered that he had a gambling problem that he hid from his wife, and that he was deeply in debt to some very dangerous people. Most importantly, she learned that he kept backup copies of sensitive financial documents in a safety deposit box, insurance against his partners if they ever decided to eliminate him. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Sarah approached Chen not as a victim seeking revenge, but as a potential business partner. She had created an entirely new identity, complete with a fabricated background in international finance and a reputation for discretion. She presented herself as someone who could help him solve his gambling debts while expanding the Brotherhood's money laundering operations. Chen was suspicious at first, but Sarah had done her homework. She knew details about his operations that only an insider would know, information she had painstakingly gathered over months of surveillance and investigation. She spoke his language, understood his concerns, and offered solutions to problems he didn't even know he had. The beauty of her approach was that she never asked for anything that would raise suspicions. She simply made herself indispensable, gradually gaining access to more and more sensitive information. Within 6 months, she had complete access to the Brotherhood's financial records, their communication networks, and most importantly, their plans for future operations. But Sarah wasn't content with just gathering evidence. She wanted to understand the full scope of their organization, to map out every connection, every crime, every victim. She needed to build a case so comprehensive, so overwhelming, that no amount of money or influence could make it disappear. This led her to the most dangerous phase of her plan. She began infiltrating the Brotherhood's inner circle, using her position with Chen to gain access to their private meetings and exclusive events. She attended their gatherings as Chen's associate, a quiet woman who took notes and rarely spoke. They barely noticed her, treating her as part of the furniture, which was exactly what she wanted. At these meetings, Sarah witnessed horrors that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She heard them planning the destruction of a whistleblower's family, laughing about a judge who had been blackmailed into compliance, casually discussing the elimination of a journalist who had gotten too close to the truth. She watched as they passed around photographs of their victims like trading cards, boasting about their conquests and comparing methods. And through it all, she smiled and nodded and took careful notes, documenting everything for the reckoning that was coming. The most chilling moment came when Richard himself attended one of these meetings. Sarah had been preparing for this encounter for years, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of seeing him again. He looked exactly the same, perhaps a little older, but still radiating that same casual cruelty that had made her life a living hell. He spoke about Emma with the same detached indifference he had once shown towards Sarah, referring to their daughter as an asset to be managed rather than a child to be loved. Sarah's hands trembled as she took notes, but she forced herself to remain calm. She couldn't afford to be discovered now, not when she was so close to having everything she needed. She listened as Richard discussed his plans for Emma's future, how he intended to use her as a bargaining chip in future business deals, how he would shape her into a perfect weapon for the Brotherhood's next generation. That night, Sarah made another crucial decision. She couldn't wait for the perfect moment to strike. Emma was in immediate danger, and every day that passed was another day that Richard could poison her daughter's mind, or worse, decide that she was no longer useful. It was time to accelerate the endgame. The final phase of Sarah's plan required her to reveal herself, but not in the way anyone would expect. She didn't want to simply expose the Brotherhood's crimes and hope the authorities would act. She had learned too much about corruption, about how money and power could make evidence disappear and witnesses vanish. She needed to create a situation where exposure was inevitable, where the truth would spread so quickly and so widely that no amount of influence could contain it. Sarah's masterstroke was to turn the Brotherhood's own methods against them. She had learned that they controlled several major media outlets, using them to suppress stories that threatened their interests. But she had also discovered that there were journalists within these organizations who were frustrated by the censorship, who were hungry for the chance to expose the truth. Working through intermediaries, Sarah began feeding information to these journalists, not all at once, but in carefully orchestrated waves. She started with smaller stories, corruption cases that seemed unrelated, but were actually connected to the Brotherhood's operations. As these stories gained traction, she escalated, providing more damaging evidence, more explosive revelations. The genius of her approach was that she made it seem like multiple independent investigations were all converging on the same conclusions. Journalists from different outlets, working with different sources, were all uncovering pieces of the same massive conspiracy. The Brotherhood couldn't suppress all of them without revealing their own involvement in the cover-up. As the media pressure mounted, Sarah activated the second part of her plan. She had been quietly building relationships with law enforcement officials who were outside the Brotherhood's influence, investigators who had been frustrated by cases that mysteriously disappeared, or witnesses who suddenly recanted their testimony. She provided them with evidence that was so comprehensive, so well documented, that they couldn't ignore it even if they wanted to. The breakthrough came when Sarah revealed the existence of the Brotherhood's archives, the detailed records they had kept of all their operations. She didn't just tell the authorities where to find these documents. She made sure copies were simultaneously released to journalists, posted on social media, and sent to victims' families. The information spread like wildfire, impossible to contain or suppress. But Sarah saved the best for last. She had one final revelation that would ensure Richard's complete destruction, something so damaging that even his closest allies would abandon him. She had discovered that Richard had been embezzling from the Brotherhood itself, skimming money from their operations and hiding it in offshore accounts. This wasn't just criminal, it was a betrayal of the very organization that had protected him for so long. When this information was revealed, Richard's allies turned on him instantly. The Brotherhood had rules, and stealing from your partners was an unforgivable sin. Suddenly, Richard found himself completely alone, facing not just legal consequences but the wrath of some of the most dangerous people in the world. Sarah watched it all unfold from the shadows, no longer the broken woman who had been pushed from a helicopter, but the architect of the most comprehensive takedown of a criminal organization in decades. She had done more than just get revenge. She had dismantled an entire system of abuse and corruption, freed countless victims, and ensured that justice would finally be served. But her greatest victory was yet to come. As Richard's empire crumbled around him, as his allies abandoned him, and his crimes were exposed to the world, Sarah finally stepped out of the shadows. She revealed herself not as a victim seeking revenge, but as a survivor who had become something far more powerful than her abuser had ever been. The final confrontation would be everything she had dreamed of and more. With the evidence now in her hands and her network of allies secured, Sarah knew the time had come to execute the final phase of her plan. The Brotherhood's annual gathering was approaching, a secretive event where all the most powerful members would converge at Richard's private estate. This was her moment, the culmination of years of meticulous planning and strategic positioning. Sarah had spent months preparing for this night. She had infiltrated the security company hired for the event, placing her own people in key positions. She had arranged for hidden cameras throughout the mansion, positioned to capture every damning conversation. Most importantly, she had synchronized her attack with law enforcement agencies across multiple jurisdictions, ensuring that when the hammer fell, there would be no escape routes for the Brotherhood's members. The evening arrived with an air of false celebration. Richard stood at the center of his opulent ballroom, surrounded by corrupt politicians, dirty judges, criminal financiers, and other members of the Brotherhood. They toasted their continued success, their untouchable status, their ability to operate above the law. Little did they know that their every word was being recorded, their every confession documented for posterity. Sarah moved through the crowd like a ghost, her elegant black dress and perfectly styled appearance allowing her to blend seamlessly among the elite. She had transformed herself so completely that even those who might have known her years ago failed to recognize the broken woman Richard had tried to murder. She was now a force of nature, calm and calculated, radiating the kind of quiet power that comes from absolute certainty. As the evening progressed, Sarah began to execute her masterstroke. She had planted specific pieces of information with different members of the Brotherhood, each designed to create suspicion and paranoia among the group. Whispers began to circulate about potential informants, about federal investigations, about assets being frozen. The atmosphere in the room gradually shifted from celebration to unease. Richard, ever the manipulator, attempted to maintain control of the situation. He called for silence, demanding to know who was spreading these rumors. But Sarah had anticipated this moment. She stepped forward from the crowd, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Hello, Richard," she said, her tone perfectly composed. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." The room fell silent. Richard's face went white as he stared at the woman he had tried to kill years ago. The other members of the Brotherhood looked between them, confusion and fear beginning to dawn on their faces as they realized something was terribly wrong. "Impossible," Richard whispered, his composure finally cracking. "You're dead. I watched you fall." Sarah smiled coldly. "You always underestimated me, Richard. That was your fatal flaw. You thought you could destroy me, but instead, you created your own nemesis." At that moment, the lights in the mansion flickered and went out. Emergency lighting kicked in, casting everything in an eerie red glow. The sound of helicopters filled the air outside, and the distinctive voices of federal agents echoed through loudspeakers, ordering everyone to remain calm and stay where they were. Sarah had orchestrated a simultaneous raid on multiple Brotherhood properties across the country. While the elite members were trapped in Richard's mansion, their associates, their financial networks, and their criminal enterprises were being systematically dismantled by coordinated law enforcement operations. The ballroom erupted into chaos as Brotherhood members realized they were trapped. Some tried to flee, only to find their escape routes blocked by federal agents. Others attempted to destroy evidence, but Sarah had already secured copies of everything. The most brazen among them tried to assert their immunity, claiming connections to powerful politicians and judges, not realizing that many of those same officials were already in custody. Richard, desperate and cornered, made one final attempt to salvage the situation. He grabbed Sarah's arm roughly, his mask of civility completely fallen away. "You think you've won?" he snarled. "You think you can destroy everything I've built? I have resources you can't imagine. I have people in places you'll never reach." Sarah looked at him with the kind of pity reserved for the truly pathetic. "Richard, you still don't understand. I didn't just survive your attempt to kill me. I thrived. While you were busy believing your own mythology, I was systematically dismantling your empire piece by piece. Your resources, frozen, your people in high places, already in custody, your untouchable status, a delusion that died the moment you pushed me from that helicopter." The federal agents moved through the ballroom with military precision, making arrests and securing evidence. Sarah watched as one by one, the most powerful members of the Brotherhood were placed in handcuffs. Judges who had perverted justice, politicians who had sold their offices, businessmen who had built fortunes on human suffering, all of them reduced to common criminals shuffling toward police vans. But Sarah's attention remained focused on Richard. She had waited years for this moment, and she wanted to savor every second of his downfall. As the agents approached him, Richard made one last desperate plea. "Emma," he said, using her daughter's name like a weapon. "Think about what this will do to her. She'll lose everything. Her father, her inheritance, her social standing. Is your revenge worth destroying an innocent child's life?" Sarah's expression didn't change. "Emma will be fine, Richard. Unlike you, I've actually thought about her well-being. She's been placed in a loving environment, far from your toxic influence. She'll grow up knowing the truth about her father, but she'll also know that justice exists, that actions have consequences, and that even the most powerful monsters can be brought down by truth and determination." The agents reached Richard and began to read him his rights. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, Sarah leaned close to him one final time. "You once told me that I was nothing without you," she whispered. "You were wrong. I was everything despite you. You tried to bury me, Richard, But you forgot that I was a seed, and now your entire world is about to be consumed by the forest I've grown." As Richard was led away, his empire crumbling around him, Sarah felt a profound sense of completion. The broken woman who had washed up on that island years ago was truly gone, replaced by someone who had not only survived but had transformed that survival into something magnificent and terrible. She had become the instrument of justice that the world needed, the force that proved no one was truly untouchable. The Brotherhood was finished. Their network of corruption and abuse would be exposed in excruciating detail during the trials that would follow. Hundreds of their victims would finally see justice. The systems they had corrupted would be cleansed and reformed, and Sarah would finally be free to live the life she had always deserved, knowing that her daughter would inherit a world that was just a little bit safer because of what she had accomplished. By now, Sarah had meticulously orchestrated every aspect of her plan. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimonies were secured, and the media expose had reached fever pitch. Richard Blackwood's empire was crumbling faster than anyone could have predicted, but Sarah wasn't finished. She had one final, devastating blow to deliver. The courtroom was packed on the day of Richard's sentencing. Sarah sat in the front row, her presence commanding respect and attention. She had transformed from the broken woman who once begged for her life in that helicopter to a force of nature that even the most powerful men feared. Her eyes never left Richard as he sat at the defendant's table, his expensive suit unable to hide the defeat written across his face. The judge's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Richard Blackwood, you have been found guilty on all charges: money laundering, conspiracy, attempted murder, and numerous other crimes that have shocked this nation. Your actions have caused immeasurable harm to countless victims." Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction as she watched Richard's shoulders slump. This was the moment she had fought for, bled for, survived for. But the courtroom drama was just the beginning. Sarah had uncovered something far more sinister during her investigation. The Brotherhood wasn't just a criminal organization, it was a centuries-old network that had infiltrated governments, corporations, and institutions worldwide. Richard was merely one tentacle of a massive octopus that had been strangling justice for generations. As the judge continued reading the sentence, Sarah's mind was already racing ahead to the next phase. She had compiled a comprehensive dossier on the Brotherhood's operations, their members, their methods, and their money trails. This information was already in the hands of investigative journalists across 3 continents, law enforcement agencies in 12 countries, and human rights organizations that had been fighting these shadows for decades. The ripple effects began immediately. Within hours of Richard's sentencing, arrests were made in London, Geneva, and Dubai. Corporate executives resigned in disgrace. Politicians announced early retirements. Bank accounts were frozen. The carefully constructed web of corruption that had protected these criminals for so long was finally being torn apart, thread by thread. Sarah had strategically leaked information to create maximum impact. She understood that taking down an organization like the Brotherhood required more than just evidence. It required a coordinated assault that would prevent them from regrouping. Every revelation was timed perfectly, each disclosure building upon the last, to create an unstoppable avalanche of justice. The media couldn't get enough of the story. Sarah Martinez had become a symbol of resilience and justice. Her journey from victim to victor resonated with millions of people who had felt powerless against corruption and abuse. She received thousands of letters from survivors, from whistleblowers, from ordinary people who had been inspired by her courage to speak their own truths. But Sarah's greatest victory wasn't in the headlines or the courtroom. It was in the quiet moments with Emma, her daughter who had been rescued from Richard's influence. Emma was receiving therapy, slowly healing from the psychological manipulation she had endured. Sarah had enrolled her in a prestigious school where she could rebuild her confidence and discover her own strengths. The island community that had saved Sarah's life was thriving beyond their wildest dreams. The agricultural empire she had built continued to generate massive profits, but now those profits were being used to fund schools, hospitals, and sustainable development projects across the region. Anna, the wise woman who had guided Sarah through her darkest hours, had become the director of a foundation that supported survivors of domestic violence. Sarah's story had sparked a global movement. Survivors of abuse were coming forward in unprecedented numbers, emboldened by her example. New laws were being passed to protect victims and prosecute perpetrators. The Brotherhood's influence was waning as their methods were exposed and their networks dismantled. The final chapter of Sarah's revenge was perhaps the most satisfying. She had acquired Richard's former mansion, the place where she had once lived in fear and isolation. But instead of living there herself, she had transformed it into a sanctuary for survivors of domestic violence. The marble halls that had once echoed with cruelty now rang with laughter and hope. The rooms where she had endured humiliation now housed women and children who were rebuilding their lives. As Sarah stood in the garden where she had once felt so trapped, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. The woman who had been pushed from a helicopter, left for dead in the vast ocean, had not only survived, but had emerged stronger than ever before. She had dismantled a criminal empire, rescued her daughter, and created a legacy of justice that would protect countless others. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, reminding Sarah of those peaceful evenings on the island where she had found her strength. She pulled out her phone and made a call to Anna, as she did every week. "Sarah, my dear," Anna's warm voice came through the speaker. "How are you feeling today?" "Peaceful," Sarah replied, a smile playing at her lips. "For the first time in years, I feel truly peaceful. Richard is behind bars, the Brotherhood is scattered, and Emma is healing. We did it, Anna. We actually did it." Anna's gentle laughter filled the air. "You did it, Sarah. You found the strength that was always within you. I'm so proud of the woman you've become." As Sarah ended the call, she felt a presence beside her. Emma had joined her in the garden, her face brighter than it had been in years. "Mom, I've been thinking about what you said about forgiveness," Emma said softly. "I think I'm ready to start healing, really healing." Sarah wrapped her arms around her daughter, feeling the warmth of hope and love that had sustained her through the darkest times. "We'll heal together, sweetheart. We have all the time in the world." The story of Sarah Martinez had become legend, but she knew it was just the beginning. The seeds of justice she had planted would continue to grow, creating a world where no one would have to endure what she had suffered. Her transformation from victim to victor was complete, but her mission to protect others would continue for the rest of her life. The helicopter had been meant to be her ending. Instead, it had become her beginning. And in the quiet satisfaction of that realization, Sarah Martinez, survivor, advocate, and architect of hope, finally found the peace that no amount of wealth or power could ever purchase. The final truth about Sarah's transformation came not through revenge, but through the profound realization that her greatest victory lay in protecting others from the darkness she had endured. Standing in the master bedroom of what was once her prison, Sarah gazed out at the sprawling grounds where she had first arrived as Richard's naive bride. The room had been completely transformed, stripped of its cold marble and oppressive grandeur, now warm with earth tones and filled with natural light, streaming through enlarged windows. The Martinez Foundation for Survivor Support had officially opened its doors 6 months ago, and already 37 women and children had found refuge within these walls. Sarah had converted the mansion's east wing into private apartments, each equipped with everything a survivor might need to rebuild their shattered life. The west wing housed counseling centers, legal aid offices, and educational facilities where survivors could learn new skills, complete their education, or simply rediscover their own voices. Emma had flourished in this environment of healing and hope. At 16, she had become an unofficial ambassador for the foundation, her own journey from traumatized child to confident young woman serving as inspiration for newcomers. She worked part-time in the foundation's youth program, mentoring other children who had witnessed domestic violence, teaching them through her own example that survival was possible, that healing was real, and that their futures remained unwritten. The irony was not lost on Sarah that Richard's wealth, accumulated through decades of exploitation and cruelty, now funded the very cause he had fought so hard to suppress. Every dollar that once symbolized his power over the vulnerable now served to empower those he had sought to control. The Brotherhood's seized assets had been distributed among multiple survivor organizations worldwide, creating a network of support that spanned continents. Sarah's morning routine had become a meditation on transformation. She would wake at dawn, not because she had to, but because she chose to. The fear that had once jolted her awake in the middle of the night had been replaced by purpose. She would walk the grounds, checking on the organic gardens that supplied the foundation's kitchen, stopping to chat with residents who were tending to the greenhouse where they grew herbs for the on-site wellness center. The legal battles had finally concluded the previous month. Richard's appeal had been denied, his sentence upheld, and his remaining assets officially transferred to the foundation. More importantly, the international investigation into the Brotherhood had resulted in arrests across 12 countries, dismantling a network that had operated in shadows for generations. Sarah had testified via video link at several trials, her voice steady and clear as she recounted not just her own ordeal, but the systematic abuse of power that had defined the organization. Dr. Martinez, the counselor who had helped Sarah navigate her own healing journey, had become the Foundation's chief psychological officer. She often reminded Sarah that true healing was not about forgetting the past, but about transforming it into something that served a greater purpose. The scars remained, but they had become symbols of survival rather than reminders of victimization. The Foundation's success had attracted attention from legislators, leading to the passage of new laws, strengthening protections for domestic violence survivors. Sarah had found herself testifying before Congress, her story becoming part of a larger movement toward justice. She had never sought to become a public figure, but she embraced the role when she realized how many lives could be touched by her testimony. On this particular morning, Sarah stood in the Foundation's main conference room, preparing for the arrival of a documentary crew. They were filming a piece about the transformation of abuse survivors into advocates, and Sarah had agreed to participate not for personal recognition, but to ensure that other survivors would see that their current circumstances did not define their ultimate destiny. Emma knocked softly on the door, now a young woman of remarkable poise and strength. She had inherited her mother's determination, but coupled it with a wisdom that came from having witnessed both humanity's capacity for cruelty and its potential for redemption. She would be starting college in the fall, majoring in social work with a focus on trauma recovery. "The film crew is here, Mom," Emma said, using the title that had taken months to feel natural again. "Are you ready?" Sarah smiled, adjusting the simple navy blazer she wore over a white blouse. She had long since abandoned the designer clothes that Richard had insisted upon, preferring clothing that reflected her authentic self rather than someone else's expectations. "I'm ready. Are you sure you want to participate in this?" Emma nodded firmly. "Our story isn't just ours anymore. It belongs to everyone who needs to know that escape is possible, that healing is real, and that the people who hurt us don't get to write the ending." The documentary interview lasted 3 hours, during which Sarah and Emma shared their journey from victims to survivors to advocates. The interviewer, a seasoned journalist who had covered domestic violence for decades, was visibly moved by their story. She had seen countless survivors, but rarely had she encountered someone who had transformed their trauma into such a comprehensive force for change. After the crew departed, Sarah found herself alone in the Foundation's library, a space that had once been Richard's private study. Where his law books and financial documents had once lined the shelves, there were now resources on trauma recovery, legal advocacy, and personal empowerment. The massive mahogany desk where he had planned his manipulations now served as a workspace where survivors drafted victim impact statements, wrote college applications, and planned their independent futures. As evening approached, Sarah made her way to the Foundation's communal dining room, where residents and staff gathered for dinner each night. It was a tradition she had instituted early on, believing that shared meals created the sense of family that many survivors had never experienced. Tonight, they were celebrating Maria's acceptance into nursing school, a milestone that had seemed impossible when she had arrived 8 months earlier with 2 young children and barely enough English to communicate her needs. The conversation around the table was animated, filled with plans and dreams that would have been unthinkable during the darkest days of their respective journeys. Sarah listened, occasionally offering encouragement or practical advice, but mostly just absorbing the energy of people who had reclaimed their right to hope. Later, As Sarah tucked herself into bed in her modest suite within the foundation, she reflected on the path that had brought her to this moment. The woman who had once cowered in fear of Richard's footsteps now slept peacefully in a home filled with the sounds of healing. Children's laughter echoed from the family wing, where single mothers were rebuilding their lives while their children played in spaces designed specifically for their safety and joy. The Martinez Foundation had become more than a shelter. It had become a model for comprehensive survivor support that was being replicated across the country. Sarah had never imagined that her personal hell would become the foundation for a movement that would touch thousands of lives. But perhaps that was the point. The most profound transformations often began in the darkest places, requiring nothing more than the decision to survive, to heal, and to ensure that others would not walk the same path alone. As sleep approached, Sarah's last thought was not of Richard or the Brotherhood or the years of terror that had defined her past. Instead, she thought of tomorrow's schedule, of the new residents arriving next week, of the legislation pending in 3 states that would expand protections for survivors, and of Emma's future as the advocate who would carry this work into the next generation. The helicopter had been meant to be her ending. Instead, it had become her beginning. And in the quiet satisfaction of that realization, Sarah Martinez, survivor, advocate, and architect of hope, finally found the peace that no amount of wealth or power could ever purchase.